Today's story takes us to the final, burning year of the Second World War, a time when war was not only a contest of guns and bombs, but also a struggle inside the human soul. In 1945, on a small island in the Pacific called Okinawa, armies fought not just for territory, but for survival. The air reeked of smoke and salt. The ground shook day and night, and in the middle of that chaos stood a jagged wall of stone the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge, a 400-foot cliff where men climbed toward almost certain death. This is the story of a medic named Desmond Doss. He carried no rifle and no bullets, yet he walked into the most violent battlefield of the Pacific War with one promise: to save life, not take it. What happened to him before he ever set foot on that ridge is proof that history is sometimes changed by people who refuse to become what war expects them to be. Let's begin. Desmond Thomas Doss grew up in the quiet hills of Lynchburg, Virginia. His family was poor and his home was often tense. His father, a veteran of the First World War, returned with hidden wounds that showed up as anger and drink. Desmond learned early that violence doesn't end when a battle ends. It can live inside a person. His mother was the steady center. She read the Bible with him and taught him to see every life as sacred. One evening, Desmond noticed the 10 Commandments on the wall. His eyes stopped on one line: "Thou shalt not kill." The words felt simple and unbreakable. From that day, he carried a quiet conviction. If he ever served in war, he would serve without taking a life. When America entered World War II, young men across Lynchburg enlisted. Desmond felt the same duty. But inside him, two truths collided. His country needed him, and his conscience would not let him kill. He didn't run from the war. Instead, he chose a role that fit his belief. In April 1942, he joined the U.S. Army as a combat medic. Training camp turned that conviction into a daily battle. Recruits around him learned to live by their rifles. When Desmond was handed his gun, he refused to touch it. At first, officers assumed fear, then defiance. The barracks began calling him names: coward, traitor, preacher. Some men tried to force the rifle into his hands at the range. Desmond only shook his head. "I'm not here to kill. I'm here to save." Commanders threatened court-martial and warned he would get others killed. Desmond didn't argue. He answered by becoming the best medic he could. He memorized medical manuals at night, practiced bandaging and tourniquets until his hands moved without thinking, and ran every drill hard. The harassment continued, boots thrown in mud, bedding soaked, but he kept treating the same men who mocked him. Slowly they saw he wasn't weak. He was stubborn in a different direction. By late 1944, his unit, the 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division, shipped to the Pacific. Desmond had never left Virginia. Now he crossed an ocean toward a war fought in jungles and caves. On deck at night, men talked about islands where entire companies died on beaches. Desmond listened quietly, checked his medical kit, and prayed for the men around him. Okinawa was the last great barrier before mainland Japan. The Japanese fortified the island with tunnels, bunkers, and hidden guns. When the invasion began in April 1945, Desmond stepped into a world that felt like a storm without a break. Shells fell constantly. Rain turned the ground to mud. Bodies lay where they fell because moving them could mean dying beside them. Desmond ran through bursts of fire with a Red Cross armband on his sleeve, not because it protected him, but because it was who he was. The Japanese defense was built on ambush. A platoon might cross a clearing safely, only for a machine gun to open from a cave they hadn't seen. Snipers nested in trees, mortars dropped without warning. Medics were targets, and Desmond knew it, but he went anyway. During one early assault, a mortar exploded near a soldier named Jack. Jack's legs were torn open and the platoon was pinned down. Desmond crawled to him using craters as cover, pressed bandages into the wounds, and kept talking about breathing, about home, about staying awake. When Jack's eyes began to drift, Desmond leaned close and said, "You're going to make it. I've got you." He dragged Jack to cover and stayed with him until help arrived. Stories like that spread fast. By mid-May, the fight reached the Maeda Escarpment, nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. From below, it looked like a broken tooth of rock. A cargo net hung down its face, the only way up. The top was a plateau riddled with pillboxes and interlocking fields of fire. U.S. units had attacked it before and been cut apart. Every climb was a gamble. On the morning of the major assault, the sky was low and gray. Soldiers checked rifles, grenades, and helmets. Desmond checked morphine, bandages, and the worn Bible in his kit. A sergeant who once called him deadweight passed by and said almost shyly, "Doss, stick close today." Desmond smiled. "I will." The climb was brutal. The net swayed under men in gear. Bullets snapped overhead. Some were hit halfway up and lowered back down. Desmond climbed, then climbed again to help others. When the platoon crested the ridge, chaos exploded on the plateau. The Japanese opened with rifles, grenades, and mortars. Smoke swallowed the air. Men screamed for cover. Desmond ran through the screams. All afternoon, he moved through dirt and fire, tying tourniquets, splinting arms, dragging men into craters by their belts. Every time he finished with one soldier, another voice called out, and he went again. By evening, the Americans had a fragile foothold on the ridge. Then, night came. As darkness fell, Japanese troops surged out of tunnels in a counterattack, yelling and firing in waves. The American line buckled. Fighting turned hand to hand. Officers finally gave the order to retreat. Down the net, now! They knew that if the unit stayed, it could be wiped out before dawn. One by one, the Americans scrambled back toward the cliff. Desmond moved with them at first, helping a wounded man to the edge, but then he looked behind him. Under the dim strobe of explosions, he saw bodies scattered across the plateau. Men who couldn't walk, men who were whispering for a medic, men left because there was no time. He could hear his comrades sliding down the net into darkness. He could also hear the wounded calling, and he knew what those calls would become if no one answered them. Desmond's feet stopped. He turned away from the net. In the thickening night, with gunfire rolling across Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss, the medic without a gun, remained alone on the plateau.
Desmond stood still for one breath, reading the night by sound. Rifles cracking below, mortars thumping somewhere behind him, and the smallest noise of all, men trying not to die. In the dark, Hacksaw Ridge wasn't a battlefield you could see, it was one you could feel. He dropped to his knees and began to crawl. The first voice he found was faint under smoke and dust. A young private lay on his side, clutching his stomach. Desmond slid beside him, pressed a bandage into the wound, and spoke in the calm tone men recognized even through terror. "Stay with me. Breathe slow. You're not alone." The private's fingers tightened around Desmond's sleeve. There was no stretcher, no team, no cover. Desmond turned his body into the stretcher. He hooked an arm under the man's shoulders, dragged him to a shallow crater, then checked the edge of the cliff. The cargo net hung there, like a black rope into nothingness. 400 feet down, beyond the darkness, his unit was sheltering in the trees. If he could get the wounded to the edge, he could lower them. If he could lower them, they had a chance. He tied a rope around the private's chest and under his arms, forming a rough sling. His hands moved in practiced knots, though his fingers were stiff, wet with blood, and shaking from exhaustion. He whispered a prayer. "Please help me get one more," and eased the man over the ledge. Below, a shout answered. The rope went taut. The private began to descend, swinging gently against the cliff face. Desmond waited for the weight to ease, then crawled back into the plateau. He found another man 10 yards away, then another. Some were groaning, some were too scared to make a sound. Desmond listened for breaths, for shifting boots, for the tiny human noises that meant there was still time. He worked almost blind, fingers finding a pulse in a neck, a tourniquet tied by touch, morphine pushed with steady hands. Every few minutes, Japanese soldiers moved through the plateau, shadows passing between bursts of artillery light. Desmond flattened himself beside the wounded and held his breath. Once, a patrol came so close he could hear boots crack twigs. The wounded man under Desmond began to whimper. Desmond covered his mouth gently and whispered, "I'm here." The patrol passed. Desmond waited 2 beats, then moved again. At one crater, he discovered 3 injured soldiers together. One was an officer, his arm badly torn. The man recognized Desmond even through pain. "Doss? What are you doing up here?" "Getting you down, sir." "You're supposed to be with the others." Desmond didn't debate. He tightened a bandage, gave morphine, and dragged the officer first. Halfway to the ledge, a mortar burst close enough to shower them with dirt. Desmond's ears rang, his vision blurred, but his hands never let go. "Stay awake. Your men are waiting." He tied the officer into the sling, checked the knot twice, and lowered him over. Then he returned for the other 2. Time became a rhythm of crawling, binding, dragging, praying, lowering. Desmond stopped thinking in hours. He measured the night in voices. Each time he delivered someone to the ledge, he heard men below shout, "We've got him!" The rope in his hands went alive, then slack again, and he knew he had to find another. Some men were too heavy for a clean drag. Desmond looped rope under their shoulders and pulled them like a sled. He used belts to secure shattered legs. He slid his shoulder low and pushed with his legs across the volcanic rock. Bullets snapped into the dirt beside him. He didn't stop. Near midnight, he came upon a soldier with a broken jaw, blood bubbling at his lips. The man couldn't speak, only stared. Desmond held his hand so he'd know a real person was there, packed gauze into the wound, and leaned close. "Blink if you can hear me." The soldier blinked once. "Good," Desmond said. "We're going down." Not everyone was alive when he reached them. Once he rolled a man over him and found no pulse. Desmond closed the soldier's eyes with 2 fingers and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then he moved on. The living were still calling. His own injuries were growing. Shrapnel had cut his forehead. Rope burn tore his hands raw. His knees were scraped open from crawling. The pain was real, but distant. It couldn't compete with the voices. Flares burst overhead now and then, turning the plateau ghost white for a second. Desmond froze each time, praying the light didn't catch his armband. When the flare died, he moved again. To keep men from scraping against the cliff as they descended, he tore a blanket from the ground and tied it into the sling, softening the ride. It cost time, but it spared blood. Below, the men catching the rope were stunned. Bodies kept arriving. 1, 2, 5, 10, lowered carefully through the dark. Somebody whispered, "Who's doing this?" Another voice answered, "It's Doss." The names spread along the line. The same soldiers who once mocked him now waited with their hands ready, eyes fixed upward. Sometime before dawn, Desmond dragged another wounded man to the ledge. Barely conscious, fragment buried deep in his chest. He checked the pulse, gave the last of his morphine, and lowered him like all the others. When the rope slackened, Desmond sat back on the dirt. The counterattack had faded, only distant gunfire remained. He listened. No more voices he could find, only wind over torn ground. He bowed his head. "Thank you," he whispered. In the gray light of morning, he climbed down the net. Men below stared as if he were a ghost, face caked in mud, streaked red, hands swollen, eyes still clear. A sergeant stepped forward, choking between laughter and tears. "Doss, how many?" Desmond shook his head. "I don't know. I just kept going." They counted anyway. The number settled around 75. In the silence that followed, no one spoke about training camp insults or rifles Desmond refused to carry. Those things belonged to another life. The unit prepared to climb again. The ridge still had to be taken. Desmond, heavy with exhaustion, lifted a hand. "Can we wait a minute? I need to pray." Weeks earlier, that would have earned curses. Now the platoon fell quiet. Helmets lowered, rifles rested. In the middle of war, they gave him a pocket of stillness. Desmond prayed quickly, for courage, for mercy, for the wounded still to come. When he finished, he stood, and the men moved with him. They took Hacksaw Ridge for good that day. Desmond later left Okinawa wounded but alive, and the army eventually honored him for what happened on that plateau. Yet the medal was never the real story. The story was the night itself. A man without a gun, surrounded by enemies and darkness, choosing again and again to pull someone back from the edge. War did not change his belief. It tested it and showed what it could do. On a cliff called death, Desmond chose mercy. And for one night in 1945, mercy was stronger than war.